Please welcome, first of all, the moderator for this panel, Loreen Arbus. Thank you so much for being here. And please welcome the director of the film and the creative director of Rooted in Rights, Jordan Melograna.
Oh, thank you. That was one terrific and really informative film. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
How did you come to this subject? Is there anything in your life that personally impacted and motivated you?
Well, the subject of subminimum wage, and actually, before I answer, everyone out there, has anyone heard of subminimum wage before seeing this film? A handful of folks?
No.
So I had heard about it only in the context of undocumented workers or even tipped workers where that's allowed. So when I came to this, it reminded me of some of the other issues I had worked on in the past. But the more I learned about it, I realized just how pervasive and complicated the issue really was. And at Rooted in Rights, we really pride ourselves on trying to figure out what issues are most important to the disability community. And of course, there's a million of them. But some of the major issues that kept rising to the top over time, among many others, was the issue of subminimum wage. And though our bread and butter is 3-minute social media videos for Facebook, we thought this was a bit too complicated for that and decided to make a feature for the first time.
It is a complicated subject, actually, and I love the way you balance the negative and went for what is possible, which was, thank goodness, very uplifting. I think it would be relevant for me to say that I'm a second-generation disability rights activist. My mother was responsible for all the ideas in Proposition 502, which preceded by 15 years the ADA, and amongst other of her ideas was that, and this is federally mandated, of course, that every sidewalk be wheelchair accessible, that every public lavatory be wheelchair accessible, that in every public parking lot there be, and sorry about the word, it's antiquated now, for handicapped only parking, and countless other ideas. And my parents co-founded United Cerebral Palsy, which is, or has been, the 5th largest health agency in the country. And I feel just, it's in my genes. So has there not been anyone who's spoken out in the course of 502 and in the course of the ADA about this situation that you've explored here?
People have spoken out and they continue to speak out. In fact, I'm happy to say the film is now inaccurate. We had one fewer state that now allows subminimum wage, with Alaska changing their laws a couple of weeks ago, and the city of Seattle, where I live, changing their laws a couple of months ago. So slowly but surely things are changing, and that is 100% due to the activists in that state who are organizing and talking to people and making and appearing and just telling people these stories, because in an issue like this, even elected officials may not know. We did a screening in Rochester not too long ago. We had a few staff members show up from the assembly, and they were just like, I never heard of it before.
No.
So that's the biggest thing we have to get over first, is just letting people know what's happening. And there have been other larger scale protests. The ones you saw there, that's the Goodwill, I believe, in Buffalo. And that was part of a large action around the country by a group called ADAPT, in which they protested several Goodwills. And unfortunately, it didn't really get anywhere. Goodwill continued to do what they were doing at their various state-run organizations. And so it didn't really quite penetrate. And so then we're still talking about it now.
There was an underlying sort of second theme, in a sense, the whole idea of silos for people with disability in terms of the workplace and sheltered workshops. And there's still a lot of controversy surrounding that, because the fact of the matter is often sheltered workshops provide the only employment that someone with disability can have. And of course, we know the other side of that picture. Has your thinking changed, and what did this all mean to you as you went about this film?
So to hit on a number of those things, the biggest thing I learned from this is that the crux point is that transition from high school. That it needs to start earlier than that, but if that part is not done right, if that part is not a time when parents and students have access to a lot of resources and a lot of options, things don't go that well. And you saw in this film where people did not have those resources, they often ended up in these sheltered workshop jobs for decades. But when they did, they landed much more easily. They did things that everyone does. They got part-time jobs or they got internships, and that they moved up from there. And so to me, that is the critical part. Because even if we could fix sub-minimum wage tomorrow, we've had the ADA for almost 30 years. And so just having a law doesn't matter if the culture doesn't catch up to it. And so we have to have a culture that says, hey, person with a disability who's a child, person without a disability who's a child, what do you want to be when you grow up? And then let me help you get there. And that's not what happens. A lot of times it's disabled child, this is what you're going to do when you grow up. And non-disabled child, what do you want to be when you grow up? And so to me, that's the biggest difference. And so when, in the past, perhaps, sure, when they were invented, shelter workshop might have been the only option. But things have changed. IDEA, ADA, when I grew up in a school that was integrated with disabled kids and non-disabled kids together. And when that changes, then it's no longer true that that's the only place that people can get jobs. We just need to put the infrastructure in place and a pipeline, not to sheltered workshops, but to jobs.
And do you think that the sheltered workshops themselves have justification ultimately in some situations or not?
What do you mean by justification?
Well, that people have work and can have pride in being able to work in an environment that supports them.
I think that if someone is truly choosing to go to a sheltered workshop, then I have no issue with that person. I have nothing to say to that person. That is up to them. But a lot of the stories that I found, the choice wasn't real. It was a choice, the only choice, and they were shuttled towards that. But what I will say is that there is an opportunity for sheltered workshops or organizations like them, because it's not always sheltered workshops that do this. There is an opportunity for them to become something else. Like we saw in Morningside in Washington State, the gentleman who runs that organization, Jim Larson, he actually flew himself out to ReelAbilities to see the film a couple of times over the weekend. But he has since become sort of a national voice on this, and he'll give speeches, and because the next step is, okay, we don't want to do sheltered workshops anymore, what do we do instead? We take the same infrastructure and we turn it into actual job training, actual job placement, and he's been very successful with that in Olympia. But he'll be the first one to tell you that it took them 5 years. It took him having to get rid of some staff who just did not want to make the change. And it took them being a lot more creative and about where they set people up and relationships they have to build with companies. But frankly, that's what shelter workshops were supposed to do in the first place. They were supposed to build those relationships and supposed to get people out. But you had a profit incentive when they started pulling in contracts, certainly. And then you had just sort of momentum. That, oh, well, he seems fine, so we'll leave him here for, however long, and he seems happy, and we won't ever ask. So.
One last question, then we open it up to everyone else for your questions. Do you think that this is going to be a part of your life going forward? I mean, you're a filmmaker. You chose a subject which you didn't have any relationship to before. Is that it? You've moved on, will move, or have moved on to something else? Where does this fit in the schemata for your life?
So I'm lucky in that I run a program called Rooted in Rights, which we talked about a little bit before, and my full-time job is to run a team making videos and making short films about disability rights issues. And we touch on the entire universe of that world, locally in Washington State, nationally in the United States, and now increasingly internationally. So there's no shortage of stories to tell. And so I will be involved in that some way, hopefully, for a very long time. But what I'd really like to see is the next film about sub-minimum wage or sheltered workshops or institutions or any of those important issues to be made by disabled filmmakers. And that's what I really want to see, because if we're talking about equality, if we're talking about a culture that has adjusted, then those are the folks who are going to be making the films. And we're trying to do that at Rooted in Rights. We have a program set up specifically to bring in first-time disabled filmmakers and give them an opportunity to tell their own stories in short-form format to probably solve this exact problem, because ultimately it shouldn't be me up here giving this, participating in this Q&A.
Right.
But here I am for now.
Well, I, for one, am extremely grateful for what you've done and are doing. If anyone agrees with me, I think we should do a hand of applause.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for that very eye-opening and revealing film. I think probably most people in this audience were as shocked as I was to see some of the things that you revealed, particularly the fact that there are people who are paid less than $1 an hour. I can understand the rationalization for paying $3 or $4 an hour. You can somehow rationalize it your own way. But how, not just in terms of conscience, but how legally do people get away with paying people 40 cents an hour or even 2 cents an hour? I don't understand how that's possible.
So the original there's so much more to say than it's in the film. The original sub-minimum wage was only supposed to be about 75% of the minimum wage when it was originally written. It was changed in the 1960s to about 50%, and then in the 1980s that went away entirely. So actually over time the sub-minimum wage went down. So there is no bottom, there is no limit. And of course, what's the point of having a minimum wage if there isn't actually a minimum? That was the whole argument at the beginning. When the minimum wage was invented in 1938 was we have to have a floor because people have to know they have to be able to earn a certain amount. So that went away after a long time. How it works is the time studies. So people are measured, people are timed basically by how productive they are. And this gets increased, this can be pernicious. There's an investigation done in Washington, the attorneys I work with did an investigation, and what they would find is you have someone start to do a job, and let's say they're not very good at it on the first day, as many of us are not very good at our jobs on the first day. So that's when they get tested. And so they get tested very poorly, of course, because it's the first time trying it. Over time, they get better at it. But their wage will not change unless they get tested again. And who controls the test? And what incentive does someone who's paying a salary have to pay you more? So that's what happens. People can get stuck. So if they're at a very, very low level at the beginning, even at the beginning, they get better in a couple of months, they still don't get paid more. So people get stuck in this trap. And if you're making $1 an hour or $2 an hour, you're not hiring an attorney to help you to fight back. And you know, to this extent, this does relate to my life a little bit. Earlier, that those are the people I worked with, were people stuck in this situation of making so little money that, and maybe even believing that's the only place they could work. Why in the world would you rock the boat? Why would you take that chance? And so everything is kind of stacked against them in that situation. And that's assuming that they are aware enough of their rights to even know they could fight back. And so the exceptions in this movie kind of only happen because of protection and advocacy agencies and other organizations who have come in to represent people for free. In the case of the Ohio, that was a big case in Ohio. It was the first time in, I think, ever that provision of the law that allows people to fight their wages was actually taken to court, and they won. And then for the first time, that organization now has to pay, that company now has to pay minimum wage. And it sent a shudder through the other people in Ohio, and I'm hoping that will change over time. But that only happened because Disability Rights Ohio, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and the National Federation of the Blind got together to finance that case. Without that, Pam and her two co-plaintiffs, they can't finance that on their own, not with what they were making. It's not going to happen. So,
I have a question up here.
One of the things that makes this film so effective and so powerful is the range of exposure that you give your topic. I lost track. There must be more than a dozen states visited here. And the custom with films like this is to focus on a case study of one place or other, and it's usually some southern state that we in the North can always feel smug and superior to. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you managed to put such a richly textured film together. This is like a complex quilt that with so many sites visited and so many people involved, the complexity of the making of the film, all in the interest of the pursuit of one topic that you draw together, is quite impressive. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you managed to accomplish that.
well, thank you. That's a quilt is the nicest thing I think anyone's ever said about the film. I had an intern who called it the Game of Thrones of documentaries because of the drastic amount of people we had involved, and it's true. The reason why is, you alluded to, is if you do a case study of one place in one context, people are very easily saying, oh, well, that doesn't happen here. That has nothing to do with me. That's in a rural area, or that's in a city, or that's in the South, or that's in the Northwest. It has nothing to do with me. And so I wanted to head that off immediately because this is an issue that affects people all over the country. And it is something that, even regardless of your political ideology, you can understand. And in fact, this is not well known, but ending the sub-minimum wage is actually in both major political parties' platforms as of the last election. And there is a Republican in Mississippi who has, for the last several years, introduced a bill specifically to get rid of this. And in the Senate, it's Democrats attaching it to their minimum wage advocacy. So this is something that I know that there's a constituency out there for. We just need to convince people that it's important and that it can work. And so showing examples both of what I think is wrong and what I think is right is really important. Showing things that happen. I didn't pay Trust Jones to say that at the end of the film, but man, was it perfect when he starts saying, not just for me in Mississippi, but people in the Northwest, and that's exactly the sentiment we went into it with. That's what I was really hoping to do. And in terms of sorting through it, the advantage of making a film like this for someone like me whose background is primarily in short films is that I thought about them in chapters from the beginning, and I thought about them as small stories that we could even break up and show separately if we needed to. So if you're doing advocacy in Kansas on entrepreneurship, show them the Pop and Joe story. If you want more money for supported employment in Washington State, like we're arguing about right now, show them the story from Washington State. And so it was both a strategic choice as well as a creative choice.
Hi, thank you so much. It was a wonderful film and very, very meaningful. I've been thinking a lot lately about the stratification of the disability community, and with more of us out in public and a larger presence of disabled people, I mean, obviously nowhere near where we need to be, I think this is a telling lesson of the underlying ethos, I think, of sequestering disabled people and keeping so many people out of the mainstream, and those of us who have the advantage of being out in public need to keep reminding ourselves of all the people that are not. But that's just a preface. But I was wondering if you might comment on, if you look, when you say that the high school to work transition is really the pivotal point and the point where the most likely advance might occur. Has there been any investigation of the way that more progressive and inclusive schools prepare people for work and don't assume that a sheltered workshop is the most likely option? Is there any connection that you've been able to find or trace between those environments and the better outcomes and the more integrated work environments that people can be in?
Sure. I mean, I don't even know if it's necessarily progressive in the way we normally understand that term nowadays. I think it often comes down to individuals and smaller stories. It's not in the movie, but Trust Jones, who ends up at the car dealership in Mississippi, his public school had a program, a 18 to 21 program, that was basically like speed dating for jobs. And so groups of people would go around and work, not for 15 years at places, but for a couple of weeks and get to know the employers, get to know the work, see what they liked. And so it was something they went into, I think, starting last year of high school and then for a couple of years after that. And so that's how Trust he got this job, but he also before that interned for, I believe, a state representative, like in a political office, and he did a couple other things before he got this job. But to me, that's both radical and very, very normal. Like, that's normally what we want to see younger people do, is do those internships and do those jobs. And again, it's the lessons we learn from the stories that we tell are the things we try to put into practice. And so we have a internship program at Rooted in Rights and a fellowship program at Rooted in Rights to do exactly that, because that's the ball game as far as I'm concerned.
We have a question up here on top.
Hi, I know that during the Obama administration, there were really edicts coming out about ending sheltered workshops, and that here in New York State, there's an imperative to the agencies to shut them down, and that there's been some pushback from families who are very concerned about what will happen to their children, their adult children, some of whom have severe disabilities and may not be able to actually engage in work. So I know that and I don't know what's happening, but God knows what's happening during the Trump administration with all of these efforts. But this has not been, it's not been hidden away. There's been a lot of public advocacy. There is a wonderful organization, Respectability, Jennifer Mizrahi. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on the ground. But I thought this was a very important film, and I want to thank you very much. I also am so shocked by the exploitation of some of our major service agencies, the enormous salaries that are held, that are received by the executive staff. We saw this years ago with United Way and this with Goodwill. And I'm just wondering, has anything been done to really put a focus on that? Because it really speaks to a corruption of a system and a true exploitation of a population.
So a bunch of stuff in that question. But let's go backwards. So far as I know, no. And honestly, the reason that is in this film is not necessarily that I have a strong opinion on whether or not the head of Goodwill should make over $500,000 a year in salary and more in that in benefits. It has more to do with the fact that the CEO of Goodwill is a big-time defender of sub-minimum wage and claims that Goodwills will go out of business if they pay minimum wage. And the funny part is, not funny, but the funny part is, we did a bunch of screenings in Kentucky recently, and the Kentucky Goodwill sent a letter to the organization sponsoring the screening saying, well, we don't do that, we pay minimum wage. And so, and they're right, because individual Goodwills determine their own salaries. So to me, that's just proof, right? Goodwill can pay minimum wage because Goodwills occasionally pay minimum wage. So I don't know what's going to happen on that front. I will say that under the Obama administration, there was a push to prior to any legislation, wanted to make sure all federal contractors made at least $10.10 an hour, I think it was, and he was going to make a rule, and that rule was originally going to exempt disabled people who were employed by federal money, and then several groups, including Autistic Self-Advocacy Network and others, got involved and pushed back on that, and that changed. So that was a very, very good thing. There's another set of rules called WIOA, which is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, that is supposed to also stop the school to shelter workshop pipeline. I think that's all great, but I also think that there are rules that shelter workshops are supposed to be following already, and they don't. And the Department of Labor doesn't have the manpower, a lot of time, the interest in enforcing it. So again, it goes back to, let's fix the laws, yes, but it's a social change that we have to make too.
We're going to take two last questions here.
Love the film. The companies that are listed that support sub-minimum wage, is there some place where we could go to see who those companies are if we make personal choices to not purchase items from those companies or support them? Would that even do, I mean, let's just say everybody in the United States decided to not go shop at Home Depot. Does that actually have an adverse effect on the people that are working in these places? And lastly, is there a list of the place like Joe's, what is it, Joe's Poppin' Popcorn? Is there some place like that? Because I'd love to order popcorn from that guy and anybody else that was like, the other people that are, doing things correctly. So where can I find those lists?
Sure. Last I checked, Pop and Joe's was selling popcorn through his website, and proud to say that the bottom dollar screenings in Texas were accompanied by Pop and Joe popcorn, a special order. In terms of the companies that support sub-minimum wage employment, a lot of people who work there may not even know it. This was the hardest part to figure out, and it's still, whenever we do screenings at universities, I was like, this is a grad school project to go figure out this net of organizations, because they are sometimes nonprofits subcontracted by nonprofits with very generic names that don't sound like what you think they would, kind of hidden away. So, and in terms of boycotts, if you're not going to shop at Home Depot, I think you should tell them why and not just stop shopping there. But where you can find a lot of this stuff out is Department of Labor actually publishes every 6 months all the current certificates. It's free, it's public, you don't need a special request, it's on the website. At least I think it still is on the website. And you'll see all the different nonprofits around the country, how many people they employ at sub-minimum wage. If you want more than that, you have to do what we did and what the folks in Rochester did, is do a Freedom of Information Act. And that'll usually tell you exactly what those wages are and for what disability they say people have. And then if you go farther than that, to find out the companies, often the workshops will brag about it on their websites, because they are trying, that's where I found a lot of the information, because they'll say, oh, well, so-and-so's, we have these corporate clients, so you can be a corporate client too. So that's really not that hard to find either, because it's not like people are hiding it. And then in some states, there's even, it goes further than that. In Missouri, the state lottery was supporting shelter workshops for a little while. I'm not sure if they still are. So this is a big part of this country. It's not something that's going to disappear immediately. And I don't know if it's going to be something as simple as a boycott. I wish it was.
We're going to take one last question over here.
I was actually going to ask something similar, because I was wondering about transparency as far as knowing which companies are doing this, and I had heard negative things about Goodwill, but I didn't really know the details. So, that was the main thing. And then also I wanted to ask if there is some movement to create more of these transition programs, and if so, how might they be funded? I mean, I know that's a complicated question, but it was occurring to me. Thank you.
I wish I knew that answer. We're getting farther and farther away from things I know as a filmmaker. But what I do know is that for the moment, I don't see national or federal changes happening anytime soon, for obvious reasons. That doesn't mean things can't happen on the state or local level. And so one of the things we want this film to do is get people up to speed and encourage them to do whatever solution it is that works in their community. And I'm kind of agnostic to what that is. Is it a transition program? Is it an entrepreneurship support? Is it more supported employment? Is it just hiring people? Is it informing people about the accommodations they were required by law to provide at a workshop, at a work site? Any of those things can help and aid this problem. So that's what we really, really want people to do, is to start educating everyone they know and let them know that this is even happening.
And I just want to ask, just because we're talking about our community here, New York State, according to what I was told by the mayor's office, was that New York State has actually phased out all these and waivers for minimum wage. Is that the case? I know in New York City, it pretty much, as far as I know, is the case. But you had mentioned to me earlier that upstate, this still exists.
So far as I know, there are still people earning sub-minimum wage in New York, and it's not off the books, but what New York and some other states are trying to do is close the front door. Is basically people who are in there, but not that many people will go in. Again, I'm skeptical that that's going to be a long-term solution. But it goes to show you that a lot of times that is left out of the conversation in New York. A couple of years ago, there was the movement to raise the minimum wage, and it did raise. When that happened, the sub-minimum wage stayed the same. It wasn't even a part of the same conversation. And so you had people very comfortable saying workers need more, not disabled workers, they have enough. And we've seen that around the country. Seattle, I mentioned earlier, Seattle changed its laws, but that was after it being the first city to raise its minimum wage to $15, and only a couple years later decided to address this. So as a social or political phenomenon, we really need workers to come together, and non-disabled workers and disabled workers both deserve equal rights. So that's something I'd like to see everywhere.
And as a positive example, I'm just going to plug here at JCC Manhattan, there are a lot of job training opportunities, and specifically there's a program called Just One Job, where we're going into corporations and trying to just create kind of like hiring equality that would include people with disabilities and diversify that. I, of course, am remembering, and Loreen included some of her rich bio here as far as her connection to this topic, but our first connection was with a film called A Whole Lot More that Loreen executive produced, which was specifically also about raising awareness to this entire topic of better inclusion of people with disabilities in the workplace, which I think if once that changes, this kind of business will not exist anymore. Loreen, any final thoughts before we? Oh, thank you. I want to point out one other film, the Designability that we screened here also very much shows the possibilities that can exist and how what we see in this film would not have a place. Want to shout out your website one more time just so people know where to go and how to take this further.
Yes, thank you. One question I like to ask is, how many people in this room have one friend? At least one friend? Everybody? At least one friend? Somebody they know? Okay, great news. So what I want you to do is go to bottomdollarsmovie.com. I want you to sign up to host a screening in your living room. I want you to invite your one friend over, and I want you to buy or rent Bottom Dollars from Vimeo on demand and show the movie to your friend. If you have more friends, that's fine. If you have a church group or you have a school or a university, you teach at a school or university, if you have a softball team or a bowling team, if you have people over your house to cook pasta and meatballs like I do occasionally, please have them over, sit down, eat your spaghetti, watch the film, maybe get a group together and start to make a change in your community.